They say Jack climbed the beanstalk and came back with gold. But what if he never came back at all? What if the moment he treated that cow for a handful of beans wasn't just the beginning of an adventure, but the end of his life? Sounds crazy, right? But stay with me, because buried inside that innocent little fairy tale, the one we were told as kids about giants and singing harps, might just be one of the oldest spiritual myths humanity has ever passed down. And here's the chilling part. In many ancient cultures, beans were never just food. They were feared, forbidden, even sacred. The Greeks believed beans held the souls of the dead. The Pythagoreans refused to eat them, not because of taste, but because they believed eating beans could trap wandering spirits inside your body. So, what does it mean when a poor boy trades away the last source of life in his home, a milk-giving cow, for seeds tied to the dead? What does it mean when a vine bursts from the ground, reaching straight into the sky overnight? What kind of story starts with a climb upward, but ends with cutting down the only bridge between worlds? You think Jack escaped, but what if Jack crossed over? What if the giant wasn't a villain, but a guardian? And the treasures Jack stole, the harp, the golden hen, the endless coins, weren't wealth, but symbols of immortality, music, and soul. Because when you really look at it, this isn't a fairy tale about luck. It's a myth about death, about the afterlife, about what waits when we dare to reach too far beyond our world. And if that possibility doesn't make you rethink everything you thought you knew about Jack and the Beanstalk, nothing will. So if you're ready to climb higher, if you're ready to go beyond the bedtime version, this video is for you.
Maybe you're wondering, why dig so deep into an old fairy tale? Why peel back layers of meaning hidden in a story about a beanstalk and a boy? Because stories like these, they're not just entertainment, they're memory. They're echoes from a time before books, before cities, before we can even write things down. They carried warnings, wisdom, and wonder from generation to generation, whispered across campfires, carved into song, woven into dreams. And somehow, they made it all the way here to us. So when we rediscover their roots, we're not just analyzing old myths, we're remembering something our ancestors thought was worth saving. If that means something to you, if you feel that chill of ancient truth creeping up your spine, then you're in the right place. This channel is where lost legends come alive again, where forgotten meanings are unearthed, and nothing is ever just a kid's story. So if that speaks to you, tap the like button to let the algorithm know these stories still matter, and hit subscribe so you don't miss what we're uncovering next, because Jack's story is just the beginning.
Not long ago, propaganda was something you could recognize. A voice on the radio, a poster on the wall, a speech filled with slogans and flags. You could feel it coming. But today, propaganda wears a much smarter face. It doesn't shout, it whispers. And most of the time, it sounds like your own thoughts. That's what makes this moment in history different. We've moved from broadcast manipulation to personalized psychological targeting, and leading the charge is artificial intelligence. Here's how it works. Every time you click, scroll, pause, or react, you're giving tiny signals to the machine. Signals about what you fear, what excites you, what angers you, what makes you feel seen. And the AI learns faster than any human ever could. It doesn't just know what you like, it starts to predict what you'll believe. And then it feeds it to you, again and again, until it becomes your reality. We used to worry about governments controlling information. Now we face something more subtle and far more invasive. Algorithms that feed you comforting lies, not because they're evil, but because they're profitable. Deepfake videos, AI-generated voices, hyper-targeted ads, none of them are science fiction anymore. We're no longer dealing with biased news anchors. We're dealing with machines that study your blind spots and slip right through them. And here's the scariest part. We don't even notice it happening because it feels personalized, convenient, right. But convenience can be a trap. Bonhoeffer never lived to see artificial intelligence, but he saw the pattern. When people stop thinking for themselves, they become vulnerable to any force that claims to think for them. He called them puppets, whose strings are pulled by whatever force happens to be the strongest at the moment. Today, that force isn't always a dictator. Sometimes it's an algorithm with no face and no conscience. So what's the lesson? We must treat information the way we treat food. What's fast and easy is often the most toxic. Thinking critically in the age of AI isn't just a skill, it's a survival tactic. In the next part, we'll see how even the smartest people, doctors, engineers, lawyers, fell for lies during a global crisis, not because they lacked intelligence, but because the pressure was simply too much. Let's go deeper.
So, if Jack wasn't quite the hero, then who was he? To understand that, we need to step outside the idea of good guys and bad guys for a moment and meet one of the oldest characters in all of human storytelling, the trickster. Every culture has one. In Norse myth, it's Loki, clever, chaotic, always one step ahead. In West African tales, it's Anansi the spider, spinning stories and outsmarting stronger foes. In Native American traditions, it might be Coyote, a shapeshifter who teaches through mischief. And in Old English folk tales, that role belongs to Jack. See, before he was climbing beanstalks, Jack was already well known in countless stories passed down by word of mouth. He was Jack the Giant Killer, Jack who outwits the devil, Jack who tricks death itself. Not with brute force, but with charm, with nerve, with just enough luck to survive what no one else could. Tricksters don't follow the rules. They bend them, twist them, sometimes break them entirely. They cross boundaries, step into forbidden places, and do what others wouldn't dare. Sometimes they help people, sometimes they just help themselves. But always, always, they reveal something deeper about the world we live in. They show us the cracks in the system, the loopholes, the uncomfortable truths we try to cover up. And Jack, he fits this mold perfectly. He doesn't ask for permission. He doesn't follow the path others set for him. He trades a cow for beans, climbs into the unknown, and steals magic from the sky. You might not approve of him, but you remember him. And that's the point. Because tricksters aren't meant to be role models. They're meant to be mirrors, reflecting both our cleverness and our contradictions. And maybe, just maybe, that's why stories about Jack have lasted this long. Not because he was perfect, but because he was real, flawed, funny, foolish, and somehow still lucky enough to survive. He wasn't the hero we were told to admire. He was the one we secretly related to. And that makes him far more dangerous and far more interesting than we thought. But Jack's mischief wasn't always seen as harmless fun. In fact, at one point, the whole story was turned into a joke. Let's talk about that next.
Believe it or not,
There was a time when Jack and the Beanstalk wasn't just told to children, it was mocked by adults. The year was 1734. London was buzzing with pamphlets, poetry, and plays. The printing press had turned storytelling into business, and business was booming. That's when a small booklet appeared, Jack Spriggins and the Enchanted Bean. But this wasn't a fairy tale in the way we think of them. It was a parody. It made fun of Jack, called him foolish, scoffed at the idea of beans growing into the sky, laughed at castles in the clouds. It treated the whole tale like a ridiculous fantasy, something no rational person should take seriously. Now, here's the important part. You can't parody something unless people already know it. Mockery only works when the audience is familiar with the story being mocked, which tells us something very revealing. Even in the 1730s, this tale of a boy and a beanstalk was already well known. Not just whispered to children at bedtime, but famous enough to be poked fun at in public print. And why was it mocked? Well, this was the age of reason. Science was rising. Philosophy was booming. People were beginning to question old stories, old beliefs, even old gods. Anything mystical, magical, or mythical, it was seen as silly, primitive, outdated. The world was moving toward logic, progress, and reason. And in that world, a story about a boy trading a cow for magic beans felt like an embarrassment. But here's the irony. The more people tried to laugh it off, the deeper the story rooted itself in culture. Because great stories, they don't die from being mocked, they adapt. And sometimes being laughed at is a sign that something powerful is hiding underneath, something that still unsettles us, like a beanstalk waiting to grow. So while the 1734 parody tried to bury Jack with jokes, it accidentally proved just how deeply planted the story already was, and it wouldn't stay buried. Because just a few decades later, Jack would rise again, but this time not as a fool, as something far more noble. Let's look at that next.
Not long after Jack was laughed at in print, something surprising happened. He got a makeover, a moral one. It was 1807, and a new version of the story appeared. The History of Jack and the Beanstalk, written by Benjamin Tabard, a London bookseller. But this wasn't just a rewrite, it was a rescue mission. Because in Tabard's hands, Jack didn't just climb the beanstalk out of curiosity or greed. He climbed it for justice. In this version, a mysterious fairy appears. She tells Jack that the giant isn't just a stranger. He's the villain who killed Jack's father and stole the family fortune. Suddenly, the whole story shifts. Jack's not a reckless thief anymore. He's a righteous avenger. He's not stealing. He's reclaiming what was his. He's not killing a giant. He's restoring honor to his family. Sounds heroic, right? But here's the thing. This version didn't come out of nowhere. It reflected the values of the time. The early 1800s, especially in Victorian England, was an era obsessed with morality, order, and proper behavior. Stories were expected to teach lessons about obedience, honesty, respectability. And Jack, the chaotic, mischievous trickster of earlier tales, he didn't fit that mold. So they changed him. They gave him a backstory, a noble purpose, a fairy to explain his actions so readers wouldn't have to question them too deeply. And that tells us something important. Stories don't just reflect the past, they reflect the values of the people telling them. When society changes, so do its heroes. And sometimes, in trying to make someone more respectable, we erase the messy parts that made them real. Think about it. Jack was once clever, unpredictable, morally gray. He lived in that strange space between right and wrong, where survival required wit more than virtue. But in this moral makeover, that complexity gets flattened. He becomes a gentleman, a proper young man on a mission of justice, a version of Jack that makes parents more comfortable, but maybe makes the story a little less honest. Because life, like folklore, isn't always black and white. And when we force stories into tidy shapes, we risk losing what made them powerful in the first place. So what did we lose in trying to make Jack a hero? Well, to find out, we have to go back to a version that was never written at all. The one passed from mouth to mouth, memory to memory. And that's where we're going. Next.
You've heard the line before. Fi Fo Fum, I smell the blood of an Englishman. It's the moment in the story that always makes kids sit up straight. A chill runs down the spine. The giant's voice thunders, and suddenly Jack is no longer in a fairy tale. He's in real danger. But here's the strange part. That chant, it didn't start with Jack. It didn't even start in the 1800s. It goes back much, much further. We find it in Shakespeare's King Lear, written around 1605. Even back then, it was already familiar, a line spoken by ogres and monsters in old folk tales. In fact, writers of Shakespeare's time referred to it as a well-known rhyme, which means it was already considered ancient over 400 years ago. But what does it actually mean? Some say it's just nonsense, a string of sounds meant to mimic the growl of a giant lumbering through the clouds. But others have a different theory. In the 19th century, a Scottish antiquarian named Charles Mackay believed it wasn't gibberish at all. He proposed that it might come from Old Gaelic, a language far older than English. According to his translation, it roughly meant, "Behold, food, good to eat, enough to satisfy my hunger." In other words, a hunting chant, not a threat, but a declaration of primal instinct. And that changes everything. Because then the giant isn't just a cartoon villain stomping around. He becomes a creature of ritual, acting out something ancient, a pattern that predates literature and maybe even language itself. Think about it. Why do so many monsters in old stories speak in rhyme? Why do witches chant in rhythm? Why do heroes sing their power into being? Because sound is magic, the oldest kind we have. Long before spells were written down, they were spoken, and rhythm made them stick, made them feel real. Fi Fo Fum is more than a catchy line. It's a relic, a verbal fossil. It survived centuries of retellings because it stirred something primal in the listeners, something we couldn't quite name but couldn't forget either. And when the giant growls those words, we're not just hearing a fairy tale. We're hearing a spell passed down, whispered across generations, echoing louder than the beanstalk itself. But what kind of being needs a chant like that? What kind of force guards the world above? To understand that, we need to look deeper into the giant himself, because he may not be who you think he is.
In every version of the story, there's one thing we're taught to believe. The giant is the bad guy. He's loud, he's frightening, he smells the blood of an Englishman, and in the end, he dies. But let's pause for a moment and look closer. What does the giant actually do? He lives in his home above the clouds. He eats. He counts his gold. He sleeps. Yes, he says he eats boys, but we never actually see him do it. What we do see is Jack invading his home over and over again. And the only time the giant fights back is when Jack steals from him a third time. Does that sound like a villain, or does it sound like a guardian? Across ancient myths and religions, there's a recurring figure, the gatekeeper, a being who stands between worlds, between the known and the unknown, between life and whatever comes after. In Greek mythology, it's Hades, ruler of the underworld. In Hindu belief, it's Yama, the lord of death. In Egyptian lore, there's Anubis, the jackal-headed protector of souls. These figures aren't evil, they're necessary. Because not everyone is meant to cross the boundary. Not everyone is ready to pass through. The gatekeeper decides. And in Jack's story, the giant might just be filling that ancient role. He lives above the clouds, a place often associated with the afterlife or divine realms. He guards magical treasures, symbols of immortality, music, and endless wealth. And when Jack climbs into that realm without invitation, the giant responds like any gatekeeper would. He defends the threshold. Now, let's take it one step further. What if Jack isn't the hero storming heaven? What if he is the intruder? A soul that refuses to wait, a mortal who defies the laws of nature to claim what isn't yet his. The story becomes something else entirely. Not good versus evil, but order versus transgression, cosmic balance versus ambition. And the giant? He becomes a mirror, a test, a force asking one ancient question. Are you ready to take what lies beyond? If Jack passes, he brings back a treasure. If he fails, he falls. That's what a true gatekeeper does. Not to punish, but to protect. Not to stop us, but to see if we're strong enough, wise enough to cross over. And maybe that's why the giant had to fall, because in the end, Jack wasn't ready for the bower he took. But what if I told you Jack's story didn't start in a book? It started much, much earlier, before literature, before language, and even before the written word existed. Let's go there next.
Jack's story may feel familiar, but what if I told you it's not just English, not just Western, not even just a fairy tale? In 2016, a team of folklorists and evolutionary anthropologists did something unusual. They took a method normally used for tracing species and applied it to stories. Yes, stories. They used it to build a kind of family tree, not of people, but of plots. They studied oral traditions across the globe, looking for patterns that repeated even when the cultures had never met. And guess what they found? They found Jack. Or more precisely, they found a story like Jack's, told again and again, from India to Italy, Scandinavia to North Africa. A poor child, a monstrous guardian, a stolen treasure from a magical world above or beyond. The tale appears in so many cultures, in so many forms, that folklorists gave it an official label, ATU 328, short for Arne Thompson Youther Index, a catalog used to organize the world's folktales. Its name? The Boy Who Stole the Ogre's Treasure. Sound familiar? Now here's where it gets even stranger. By mapping how these stories changed over time and space, how they evolved across languages, migrations, and generations, researchers traced them back, way back, over 5,000 years. Long before books, long before cities, before writing even existed. This kind of tale about a cunning youth stealing from a powerful otherworldly being has been told for millennia. And here's the part that gives you goosebumps. These stories likely originated with a group of prehistoric people known as the Proto-Indo-Europeans, a culture that lived on the grasslands between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. They had no temples, no written records, but they had language, and they had stories. Stories like this one. So when we tell Jack and the Beanstalk today, we're not just telling a bedtime tale. We're passing along a message that's older than any nation, any alphabet, any recorded history. We're echoing something whispered from mother to child, from elder to tribe, for thousands of years. And maybe that's why this story still resonates. Because it isn't just about Jack, it's about us. The human need to climb, to reach, to risk, to take something powerful and bring it back home. So, what kind of people first told this tale? Who were these Proto-Indo-Europeans? And why did they feel the need to pass down a story like this? Let's meet them next.
To understand where Jack's story truly began, we have to go back, way back, before England, before Rome, before even the first pyramids rose from the sands, to a forgotten people we now call the Proto-Indo-Europeans. You've probably never heard of them, and that's not surprising, because they left almost nothing behind. No stone temples, no written language, no monumental cities carved into the earth. What they did leave was stories. The Proto-Indo-Europeans lived roughly between 4,500 and 2,500 BCE on the wide, wind-swept steppes stretching between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea in what is now parts of Ukraine, southern Russia, and western Kazakhstan. They were herders, not kings, nomadic, not settled. They followed their flocks across the grasslands, living in wagons, telling stories around fires under open sky. We know about them not through monuments, but through language. Linguists realize that many of the world's languages, Greek, Latin, Sanskrit, Norse, Celtic, Slavic, even English, can be traced back to a single root. And from that root, we found the people who likely spoke it first. They were the ones who gave us the earliest seeds of the words we still use today, like mother, night, and yes, even God. But alongside those words, they passed down something else. Myths. Not in books, of course, but in memory. One of those memories, a tale about a brave or reckless child who crosses into a higher world, encounters danger, and steals something magical. That's the shape of the story we now call Jack and the Beanstalk. It might have sounded different 5,000 years ago, different names, different symbols, but the heartbeat of the tale was already there. A climb, a guardian, a theft, and a return. You see, even before we had nations, we had narratives. Before we had maps, we had myth. And sometimes the only thing a culture can carry as it moves from place to place is a story. Something small enough to fit in the mouth,
but big enough to carry meaning across generations. So when you hear Jack's tale, you're not just hearing fiction. You're hearing a whisper from a vanished world. A people who had no cities, but who somehow built a bridge that still reaches us today. And what was Jack really climbing? Not just a beanstalk, but the bones of myth, the roots of language, a tower of memory so ancient we barely recognize it anymore. But if you know where to look, you can still see it growing. So now that we know where the story began, let's explore how it echoes through the great myths of the world. Because Jack isn't climbing alone.
Jack's climb, his theft, his escape from the world above. It all follows a pattern so ancient, so powerful, that it shows up across cultures, continents, and millennia. Folklorists call it the cultural hero motif. It's the story of an outsider, often young, often underestimated, who dares to cross into a forbidden or sacred realm, steals something powerful, and brings it back, not just for himself, but for everyone. Let's start with one of the most famous, Prometheus. In Greek myth, Prometheus is a titan, not a god, but something close. He sees humanity suffering in the dark, so he climbs to the realm of the gods and steals fire. Not just warmth, but light, knowledge, the spark of civilization. He brings it down to earth, to us. And for that, he's punished. Changed to a rock, his liver devoured each day by a vulture, only to grow back and suffer again. But we remember him not as a villain. We remember him as a hero. Then there's Odin in Norse mythology, the All-Father, wise and watchful, but not all-knowing. To gain true wisdom, he sacrifices himself. He hangs from the world tree Yggdrasil for 9 days and nights. He gives up an eye. He crosses into the realm of the giants and steals the mead of poetry, a magical drink that grants insight, storytelling, and song. Again, a divine gift, stolen from a sacred place and brought back to elevate humanity. And now, Jack, a poor boy with nothing, no sword, no title, no destiny. He climbs into the sky. He faces a giant, a guardian, and he takes not just gold, but a singing harp, a hen that lays golden eggs, and in some versions, a bag that never empties. Music, sustenance, abundance, not tools of war, but symbols of life. And yes, he steals them. Just like Prometheus, just like Odin. Because that's what cultural heroes do. They don't always follow the rules. They break them, not out of greed, but to bring something greater back to the world. And that's the lesson buried deep in Jack's tale. Sometimes the gifts that transform a civilization don't come from safe choices. They come from risk, from rebellion, from the courage to reach where no one else dares. Jack is more than a boy with beans. He's part of a lineage, a long tradition of those who defy the gods, steal the sacred, and light a fire in the dark.
But what if Jack wasn't climbing a beanstalk? What if he was climbing something older, deeper, a tree that connects all worlds? Let's look at that next.
We often think of the beanstalk as just that, a magical vine that grows overnight, shooting up through the clouds into some far-off fantasy. But what if it's more than that? What if Jack's beanstalk is part of a much older symbol? One that appears not just in fairy tales, but in the myths and religions of cultures across the world. That symbol is called the world tree, or in more scholarly terms, axis mundi. It means the axis of the world, a vertical connection between realms, heaven above, earth in the middle, and the underworld below. And almost every ancient tradition has one. In Norse mythology, it's Yggdrasil, a vast ash tree that links the 9 worlds. Gods live in its branches, serpents writhe at its roots. Odin hangs from it to gain wisdom. In Hindu cosmology, there's the Ashwatha tree, its roots growing upward into the heavens, and its branches reaching down to earth, a perfect inversion of how we think the world should work. In Mayan belief, the Ceiba, or world tree, stood at the center of the universe, its trunk the pathway for souls traveling between the land of the living and the land of the dead. Even in Siberian and Mongolian shamanic traditions, a sacred pole or tree was climbed during rituals, symbolizing the soul's journey into higher spiritual realms. So when Jack climbs his beanstalk, he's not just sneaking into a castle, he's ascending the cosmic ladder, a living, breathing version of the world tree. The stalk grows without warning, almost as if called into being by fate. It pierces the sky, reaching into a realm that doesn't belong to Jack, but calls to him anyway. And notice what he finds there: a harp that sings, a hen that lays golden eggs, a bag that never runs out. These aren't random fairy tale treasures. They're symbolic. Music, abundance, eternal provision, gifts not just for survival, but for the soul. And like many who climb the world tree, Jack doesn't come back unchanged. He's crossed a boundary few dare to touch. He's brought something back from the sacred realm. But the question is, at what cost? Because the world tree doesn't just connect realms, it divides them. And not everyone who climbs is meant to return. So what kind of plant could grow so quickly, reach so high, and serve as a ladder to the other world? Let's take a closer look, because in some ancient beliefs, the answer might just be in the bean itself.
It sounds almost silly at first. Beans. Of all the things to fear, why would anyone, especially an ancient philosopher, be afraid of beans? But that's exactly what the followers of Pythagoras believed. Yes, Pythagoras, the same man we remember from math class, the triangle guy. But Pythagoras was more than a mathematician. He was also a mystic, a seeker of sacred patterns, cosmic harmony, and the secret nature of the soul. And to him and his followers, beans were dangerous, not because of how they tasted, not because of how they grew, but because they were believed to contain souls. The Pythagoreans taught that when a person died, their soul would begin a journey of reincarnation, moving from one life form to the next, and sometimes that soul might pass through a bean. Yes, a literal bean. They believed the root system of bean plants looked like tiny embryos, little human forms taking shape beneath the soil. To eat a bean, then, was to risk eating a soul in transition. And even more strangely, they associated the gas caused by beans with the breath of spirits, a ghostly release from the body. To them, the bean plant wasn't just food. It was a bridge, a living link between the world of the living and the land of the dead. So when Jack, hungry and desperate, trades his family's last cow, a source of nourishment, milk, and life, for a handful of beans, he isn't just making a bad deal. He's making a ritual exchange. He's trading sustenance for symbolism, life for liminality. And what grows from that trade? A stalk that reaches into the sky, a stairway to another world, a spiritual ladder born from a forbidden seed. Now it starts to make more sense, doesn't it? Jack isn't just climbing to steal treasure. He's climbing into a realm that's not meant for the living. And the beanstalk, it's not just magic. It's mythic. A soul path rooted in the earth, stretching toward the heavens. Across many ancient traditions, death isn't something that pulls us down. It lifts us into the sky, into the stars, into the beyond. And the bean, in its strange, simple way, was seen as a doorway, not just a plant, but a passage. So maybe Jack didn't just plant a beanstalk. Maybe he planted a crossing. And what he finds at the top, well, let's just say he's not the only one who's ever climbed that path. Because myths across the world, from India to Mesopotamia to the Americas, tell of heroes who cross into the next world and try to bring something back. Let's meet a few of them next.
Now that we know what the beans might represent, let's ask a question that almost no one dares to ask. What if Jack died that night? Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but truly. The moment he went to bed hungry, ashamed, and tossed the beans out the window, what if that wasn't the beginning of a fairy tale, but the beginning of an afterlife journey? Think about it. In many ancient traditions, death isn't a downward fall. It's an ascent. The soul rises to the stars, to the sky, to a sacred realm above the clouds. In Mayan cosmology, the Milky Way itself was seen as a great celestial tree, a path that the soul would travel after death, climbing toward the spirit world. In Hindu belief, the soul ascends through levels of existence, passing into other realms, sometimes through trees, sometimes through light. And in Siberian and Mongolian shamanism, the soul of the initiate climbs a sacred pole or tree to reach the realm of ancestors, spirits, and gods. So when Jack wakes up the next morning and sees that beanstalk, maybe he's not just waking from sleep. Maybe he's waking into something else. And what he finds above? It's not just a castle. It's a realm of symbols. A hen that lays golden eggs, a self-replenishing source of life. A harp that sings by itself, a divine sound, like the voice of the cosmos, or maybe a soul remembering who it is. A bag of gold that never runs out, a metaphor for eternal provision. These aren't ordinary treasures. They're spiritual archetypes. And then there's the giant. Not just a monster, but a gatekeeper, like Hades, like Yama, like every guardian who keeps the living from trespassing into the land of the dead. He steals from him again and again, until finally he cuts the beanstalk,
the very bridge between the worlds, and the giant falls. Is that victory? Or is that denial? A refusal to fully cross over? A soul grabbing what it can and running back to the safety of flesh and earth? You see, this isn't just a story about adventure. It's a story about the borderlands, that thin, trembling line between life and whatever comes after. And maybe that's why this tale stays with us. Because whether or not Jack really died, his journey is one we all recognize in the quiet moments, when we face loss or transformation or the great unknown. He climbs, he finds, he takes, and he returns changed. But Jack isn't the only soul climber in ancient myth. Others have done it too, sometimes to save a loved one, sometimes to steal fire, sometimes to remember who we are. Let's meet them next.
By now you've probably noticed Jack's story feels much bigger than a boy and some beans. It touches something older, something deeper, something inside us. And no one understood that better than Carl Jung. Jung believed that stories, especially myths and fairy tales, aren't just entertainment. They're maps of the human soul. He called them archetypes, universal patterns that live in our collective unconscious, characters, journeys, and symbols that show up everywhere because they come from in here, from the inner landscapes we all carry. So let's look at Jack through a Jungian lens. First, there's the call to adventure. Jack is thrust into action when he trades the cow for beans. That trade? It's not just foolishness. It's a leap into the unknown, an inner decision to step off the beaten path. Then there's the climb. Not just a physical ascent, but a psychological one. He's rising into the higher realms of his own psyche, toward consciousness, selfhood, and confrontation. At the top waits the giant. And here's where Jung's work shines, because the giant, more than anything, represents what Jung called the shadow. The shadow is the part of us we try to avoid, the parts we judge, the fear, the rage, the greed, the power we're afraid we're not ready for. The shadow isn't evil, it's repressed. And in every great myth, the hero must face it, not to destroy it, but to integrate it. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, Jung wrote, but by making the darkness conscious. Jack doesn't kill the giant out of courage, he does it out of fear. Instead of integrating his shadow, he runs from it, steals from it, and cuts it down. That's one way to deal with our inner darkness, but it's not always the most mature. So what's the lesson here? Maybe it's this. You can climb all the way up, you can face your fears, steal back your power, even run away with the gold, but unless you make peace with the giant, with that wild, raw, terrifying part of yourself, you'll always be running. Jack wins, but he doesn't heal. Not yet, because real transformation doesn't come from slaying the shadow. It comes from shaking its hand. And maybe that's why we keep telling this story, because deep down, we all have a giant in the clouds. We all have a stalk to climb, and we all wonder what would happen if we stopped running and finally listened to the voice that growls from the mist. Fi Fo Fum. So why does this ancient tale still echo so strongly today? Let's step back and see what it's trying to remind us about ourselves.
Have you ever wondered Why do we keep telling these stories? Not just Jack and the Beanstalk, but all the old ones. The myths, the legends, the fairy tales we heard as children and somehow never forgot. They weren't written in stone, they weren't signed by great philosophers, and yet they endure. Why? Because these stories are not just about what happened, they're about what always happens. They're about us. You see, fairy tales speak in symbols, in dreams, in riddles, in feelings you can't quite explain. They don't give us clear instructions, they give us mirrors. Mirrors that reflect our deepest fears and our highest hopes. In Jack's case, it's the fear of not having enough, the hunger that drives him, the risk of losing everything just for the chance at something better. It's the curiosity that leads us beyond the rules, the daring to climb into the unknown, the temptation to take what isn't offered, and the consequences that follow. That's not just Jack's journey, that's ours. We all have moments where we trade security for possibility, where we climb without knowing what's at the top, where we take risks that don't make sense, but feel like they have to be taken. And we all have giants to face. Sometimes they're external, a system, a person, a challenge. Sometimes they live inside us, a fear, a doubt, a secret we've been avoiding. The stories stay because the questions stay. Who am I when no one's watching? What would I do if no one said no? What am I willing to climb for, and what am I willing to leave behind? Fairy tales survive not because they're childish, but because they say things adults have forgotten how to say. They speak in the language of the soul, where the beanstalk is more than a plant, the giant more than a monster, and the golden harp more than a treasure. They remind us that we're more than flesh and bone, that we're story-born, meaning-seeking, always reaching. So yes, Jack is just a tale, but it lingers, because somewhere inside us we still feel the weight of the axe, the wind in the clouds, the thrum of the harp, the tremble of that first step upward. And even if we outgrow the story, it never really outgrows us. But what does all of this leave us with? Just one final climb. One last question. Let's take it together.
So now we've followed Jack's journey, step by step, from the humble cottage and the desperate trade to the sky-bound beanstalk, the guardian giant, and the treasures stolen from a world not quite ours. But let me ask you one final question. What do you bring back from the stories you climb? Because that's what it's really about, isn't it? Not just the journey, not just the climb, but the return. What we carry home, what changes in us, what we now see differently because we dared to go higher. You don't have to scale a stalk into the clouds to understand what Jack felt. We all face those moments. The moment you leave a job that feels safe to pursue something uncertain, something calling. The moment you open a door inside yourself and discover a memory, a dream, or a shadow you thought you'd buried. The moment you speak the truth, even when it costs you, that's the climb. And every climb, if it's honest, comes with risk. You might fail. You might lose something. You might even lose part of yourself. But if you make it back, just like Jack, you don't come down empty-handed. You come back with a gift. Maybe it's insight. Maybe it's a story. Maybe it's the quiet strength that says, I've been there. I know the way.
So maybe Jack didn't do it perfectly. Maybe he ran from his shadow instead of facing it. Maybe he stole rather than asked. But he went, and he came back. And sometimes that's enough to change a life or a world. In the end, this isn't just a story about a boy and a vine. It's a soul map, a whisper from the ancient world telling you there's more to life than what's at eye level. There's doors hidden in ordinary things, magic growing in forgotten places, and beanstalks waiting in the quiet corners of your mind, ready to rise if you're brave enough to plant the seed. So here's your invitation. Climb. Climb into the story. Climb into the self. Climb toward whatever calls you, even if you don't yet understand why. And when you return, don't come back empty-handed. Bring a gift, a truth, a question worth asking out loud. Because someone, somewhere, is still sitting at the bottom of their own beanstalk, wondering if it's worth the risk. Maybe they're just waiting to see you climb first. If this story opens something in you, a thought, a memory, a shift, don't keep it to yourself. Share this. Leave a comment. Pass it on. Because we're all on the same mountain, climbing toward meaning, one ancient step at a time.